By the summer of 1943, RAF Bomber Command was bleeding. Every raid into the Ruhr, every penetration of German airspace, came with a cost that the math no longer supported. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, the architect of the strategic bombing campaign, had watched loss rates climb past 5% on certain nights. Beyond 5%, Bomber Command had calculated, a crew's chance of surviving a 30-mission tour collapsed to almost zero. The reason for those losses had a name. General Major Joseph Kamhuber, head of XII Fliegerkorps, had spent 3 years constructing what the Germans called the Himmelbett system, the four-poster bed. The British called it the Kamhuber line. Stretching from Denmark down through the Low Countries and into France, it was a chain of overlapping radar boxes, each one roughly 45 kilometers wide. Inside every box sat a single Wurzburg radar tracking the incoming bomber, a second Wurzburg tracking the German night fighter, and a ground controller in a darkened bunker speaking directly into the pilot's earphones, vectoring him onto the kill. Behind the line, the Luftwaffe operated Liechtenstein BC and SN-2 airborne intercept radars in the noses of Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Junkers Ju-88s. A bomber that crossed the line was acquired, tracked, and handed off to a fighter that could close into 200 meters and open up with twin 20mm cannons before the rear gunner ever saw him coming. Hauptmann Wilhelm Herget of NJG-4 had shot down 8 Lancasters in a single night using this system. The wall in the sky was working, and the British knew exactly how to break it. They had known since 1942. Device was officially designated number 26, and it was almost insultingly simple. Strips of aluminum foil, cut to precisely 27 centimeters by 2 centimeters, exactly half the wavelength of the German Wurzburg radar at 53 centimeters. Drop enough of them, and every strip would resonate, reflecting a radar return the size of a 4-engine heavy bomber. The British code name was Window. The Americans, working on the same idea independently, called it Chaff. Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern had perfected it in April 1942, and then it had sat in a warehouse for 15 months. The reason was Churchill himself. The Prime Minister, advised by his scientific staff including R.V. Jones, had been told that the Germans had probably developed the same countermeasure. The moment Britain used Window, the Luftwaffe would copy it and unleash it on the British night fighter screen defending the home islands. Better the thinking went to wait, but by July 1943 the calculus had changed. The 8th Air Force was now bombing by day. The cavity magnetron and H2S ground mapping radar had given Bomber Command navigation accuracy it had never possessed. And Harris wanted Hamburg. The plan was called Operation Gomorrah, 8 nights, roughly 3,000 sorties. The target was Germany's second-largest city, its U-boat yards, its oil refineries, its 800,000 civilians. On the afternoon of July 24, 1943, in airfields across Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, RAF crews of numbers 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8 groups were briefed for the first time on the silver foil bundles being loaded into their flare chutes. Each Lancaster, each Halifax, each Stirling and Wellington carried packets containing 2,000 strips. They were ordered to throw out 1 bundle per minute, starting at a precise coordinate over the North Sea. At 23:43 hours, the lead pathfinders of Group Captain John Searby's No. 83 Squadron crossed the German coast. 791 bombers were behind them, and at that moment, every Wurzburg operator in northern Germany watched his screen explode. Picture what they saw. Trained men, some of them on station for 2 years, suddenly faced with a cathode ray tube that showed not 700 targets but 7,000. The blips smeared into a single saturated glow. The plotting tables in the Luftwaffe command bunkers, where women called Helferinnen pushed wooden markers across maps of the Reich, became useless within 90 seconds. The ground controllers tried to issue vectors. They could not. The night fighters circled their Himmelbett boxes screaming for instructions and getting nothing back but garbled chatter. Major Hans-Joachim Jabs of NJG-1 reported afterward that his Liechtenstein radar showed 75 separate contacts within a 3-kilometer cone, every one of them a phantom. Some pilots, convinced their equipment had failed, slammed the side of their cockpits. Others assumed the British had jammed the system electronically and broke off entirely. And while this happened, while an entire continental air defense network collapsed inside 10 minutes, 791 bombers cruised through the gap and arrived over Hamburg almost completely unopposed. Of those 791 aircraft, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate of 1.5% on a target that had previously cost 6. For the men of Bomber Command, it felt miraculous. For Hamburg, it was the beginning of an apocalypse. 2,284 tons of bombs fell on the city that night. Half were incendiaries, magnesium and phosphorus sticks designed to start fires faster than civil defense could contain them. 3 more raids would follow over the next 8 days. But the catastrophe came on the night of July 27th, the second mass attack. By then, a heat wave had baked Hamburg for days. Wooden-roofed timbers were tinder dry. And the bombing pattern that night happened to concentrate inside roughly 2 square miles of the Hammerbrook district. The fires merged. Temperatures inside the burning quarter reached 800 degrees Celsius. Hot air rose so fast it created hurricane-force winds at ground level, sucking oxygen out of cellars and air raid shelters and pulling fully grown adults off their feet and into the flames. Hamburg's fire chief, Hans Brunswig, later described uprooted trees flying through streets. This was a Feuersturm, a firestorm, and it was the first time in history a city had burned this way from the air. Between 37,000 and 43,000 civilians died in Operation Gomorrah, the overwhelming majority on that single night. 1 million people fled the city in the following week, and here is what the history books rarely emphasize. Inside the burning streets, while families suffocated in shelters under the Albechtel, German night fighter pilots above the city were still circling in confusion, still arguing on the radio, still chasing radar returns that were not there. Some of them landed without firing a shot. The chief of the Luftwaffe's Signals Intelligence Service, General Wolfgang Martini, had warned Hermann Göring about Window 2 years earlier. Göring had buried the warning, fearing the Luftwaffe would be ordered to deploy the same weapon and give the secret away. Now, when the Reichsmarschall was briefed on the disaster at his headquarters in Karenhall, he reportedly stared at the wall for several minutes before saying only, "Das ist das End." This is the end. He did not mean the war, he meant the system. Kammhuber's entire architecture of night defense, 3 years and untold millions of Reichsmarks, had been rendered obsolete in a single sortie by a 30-pound bundle of metal foil. Within weeks, Kammhuber would be removed from command of XII Fliegerkorps and reassigned to Norway. But that was only the opening move. What happened next is where the night air war actually changed, because the Luftwaffe did not surrender the night. While Hamburg still smoldered, a Junkers Ju-88 pilot named Major Hajo Hermann was already pitching a new doctrine to Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch. His idea, which he called WarDossier, wild boar, was almost a confession of defeat. If radar could no longer find the bombers, single-engine day fighters would be sent up at night, without radar, to hunt by the light of the burning cities below. Pilots would use the firelight, the searchlights, the bomb flashes themselves to silhouette the British bombers from above and dive on them. It was crude. It was costly. It worked. JG-300, the first WarDossier wing, claimed dozens of kills in the weeks after Gomorrah. And in parallel, the Luftwaffe rolled out Zamsau Tame Boar, a new doctrine for the radar-equipped night fighters. Instead of being tied to individual Himmelbett boxes, they would be guided by long-range observation to the rough bomber stream and then ordered to find their own targets inside it, working the stream from the inside out for hours. The Liechtenstein SN2 radar, operating on 90 MHz, was retuned to a frequency that Window did not yet jam. Within 4 months, British loss rates were climbing again. By the Battle of Berlin in the winter of 1943 to 1944, Bomber Command was losing crews at the catastrophic rate it had feared all along. On the night of March 30th, 1944, the Nuremberg raid, flown into improved Zamsau defenses, cost the RAF 95 bombers in a single mission, nearly 12% of the force dispatched. The most expensive night in Bomber Command's history. But the doctrine that emerged from Gomorrah went much further than the war itself. Every electronic warfare unit in every modern Air Force traces its lineage to those foil strips falling over the North Sea. The American B-52 over Hanoi in 1972, releasing chaff bundles to confuse SA-2 batteries. The Israeli F-4s in 1973. The F-117 strikes against Baghdad in 1991. Every one of them is the descendant of a 27 by 2 centimeter aluminum strip dropped at 43 hours on July 24, 1943. Hamburg taught the world a lesson that the world has never unlearned. Air defense is not a wall. It is a conversation between signal and noise. And on a quiet summer night in 1943, the British poured so much noise into that conversation that the Luftwaffe never fully recovered. CTA 1213 Min. If you have made it this far, you are the kind of person this channel was built for, viewers who want the operational details, the actual decisions, the real men who made them. Subscribe to WarDossier, because there are dozens of battles like this one where a single piece of technology, or a single order, rewrote the entire war. And drop in the comments, which side do you think handled the radar war better in the end, the British with their countermeasures or the Germans with Zomsau? I want to hear your strategic read. Outro 1315 Min. The strangest thing about Operation Gomorrah is the moral arithmetic it left behind. Arthur Harris would defend the firestorm until his death in 1984. The Hamburg survivors, and there are still a few alive in 2026, describe it in terms that bombing campaign theorists never used. And the German night fighter veterans who flew that night, men like Wilhelm Herget and Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, would later admit in post-war interrogation that the moment they realized their radar was lying to them was the moment they understood Germany would lose the war. Not at Stalingrad, not at Kursk. In the cockpit of a Bf-110 over Schleswig-Holstein, watching 7,000 bombers that were not there. One strip of foil. 40,000 dead. An entire defensive doctrine in ashes. That is the lesson of Gomorrah, and it is the reason military planners still spend more on electronic warfare today than on the aircraft themselves. If this one hit, my video on the Nuremberg raid of March 30th, 1944, the night the Zomsau doctrine took its revenge and Bomber Command suffered its worst loss of the war, will blow your mind. It is the other half of this story, and you do not want to miss it. On the night of July 24th, 1943, RAF Bomber Command unleashed a weapon Winston Churchill had personally kept secret for almost 2 years, and in less than 10 minutes, the most advanced air defense network on Earth collapsed. This is the full operational story of Operation Gomorrah, the 8-day bombing campaign against Hamburg that killed roughly 40,000 civilians, broke the Kammhuber line, and forced the Luftwaffe to invent entirely new night fighter doctrines. We cover Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris and Group Captain John Searby of No. 83 Squadron, General Major Joseph Kammhuber's Himmelbit radar boxes, the Wurzburg and Liechtenstein systems, the introduction of window chaff, the Hamburg firestorm in the Hammerbrook district, and the rise of Major Hajo Hermann's WarDossier and Zomsau tactics, including their devastating revenge at Nuremberg in March 1944. 00, the night the radar lied 00, 45 the Kammhuber line 03, 00 Operation Gomorrah begins 06, 00 the firestorm 09, 00 WarDossier and the aftermath 12, 00 subscribe 13, 00 the legacy of